MTC 1.20. If you have ever moved your office or home, you realize how much stuff you really have. It is estimated that we use 20% of what we possess only 80% of the time. 2080. So, why do we keep it all? You guessed it, because we think we might need it. As with other important things, letting go of information can be difficult because we are not sure of its value in the future. Thus, our tendency is to keep it all. But saving every scrap of information that comes our way makes it difficult to access the information we really do need. Who has time to sort through everything to find a particular piece of needed information? Thus, one of the first principles to organization is consolidating our information and data to weed out the stuff we don't need and group the data we do want to keep. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 1.21. Not every home run swing is perfect and not every home run clears the fence. Inside the park, home runs happen when a batter hits one far enough into the outfield that he can get all the way around the bases before the fielders get the ball back home. The effect on the score is the same as when the ball leaves the park, but the hitter has no time to smoothly cruise home or take in the moment. He has to streak around the bases, running as fast as he can to beat the throw. You don't reach every milestone in your life exactly the way you planned. Sometimes, the guidance and advice you get isn't perfect, the people along the way haven't been loving and selfless, the swing doesn't come together the way it should, and you're not able to clear the fence and smoothly cruise home. To get where you want to go, you may have to run much harder, making your own path and teaching yourself. But when you hit your inside the park home run, you can be very proud that you overcame the hardships on your way and scored despite them. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 1.22. Self-learning draws a lot from self-discipline because you are learning concepts or skills on your terms. There is a need for you to be particular with the way you spend your learning process time. Only so much time can be allocated to the learning, breaks, and everything else in between. Without the assistance of a formal structure, then you may run the risk of not accomplishing anything at all. That is one of the significant advantages when it comes to the curriculum of a formal educational institution. They have milestones for the syllabi that measure the progress of learning, and there are particular time constraints is that you have the freedom to rearrange the time allotted for skill attainment and you have the freedom to set up your own milestones. Provided they are reasonable and do not allow for massive procrastination, the self-set standards should work for your benefit. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 1.23. As mobile communication platforms such as smartphones become more standard, important information that is available in face-to-face, F2F, communication through facial expression and body language is absent. This change could have an effect on the connectedness of groups and contribute to misunderstanding in communications. Consequently, research on emoticons has largely been dedicated to determining whether emoticons can provide the necessary socio-emotional context required for meaningful communication. In general, some researchers have found that emoticons are useful to this end. These simple icons convey social and emotional cues that are otherwise not available in electronic communications. In F2F communication, these cues are critical for proper interpretation of the message, understanding intent, perceiving emotion, and a number of other reasons. Before emoticons were used, this information was largely lost in electronic communications. After the advent of emoticons, communicators could include emotional and nonverbal-like information to fill this gap. Emoticons can lighten the mood, add sarcasm, express annoyance, and provide a range of expressions to textual communications. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 1.24. Self-control has been an important factor in Western civilization. In his recent economic history, Clarke contended that it played a decisive role in the Industrial Revolution and the economic and cultural ascendancy of Western civilization. Clarke, noting that the Industrial Revolution occurred in England rather than other countries with similar governmental and other structures, Clarke proposed that the key difference was that in England, the upper classes reproduced far more than the lower ones, and given the limited opportunities in the social structure, this entailed downward mobility. Clarke. As a result, the lower classes gradually filled up with people who had the genetic and environmental benefits of the upper classes, including self-control. This created the potential for a working class that could be relied on to be punctual, diligent, and effective at the factory work required for the Industrial Revolution, something Clarke notes that many Third World countries have been still unable to achieve centuries after the British showed the way. Clarke 3. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 1.29. Partly in response to Freud's ideas, Jean Piaget suggested that children up to the age of about 7 years remain locked within a self-centered view of the world, which he called cognitive egocentrism. Freud, Jean Piaget 7. This can be seen as midway between Freudian infantile autism and the fully socialized awareness that adults possess. Freud. Despite being able to talk, infants fail to realize that other people may perceive and know different things from themselves. This means that the child does not understand itself proper being, since it has not realized that its own thoughts, perceptions, knowledge, and memories are dependent on its own particular experience and perspective. Only when children realize that other people can have systematically different experiences and perspectives from their own, are they able to take a perspective on their own thoughts and, one might say, know about their own minds. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 1.30. There are many factors that influence consumer and producer decisions. Take the example of a local newspaper, on sale every day in a particular city. On the occasion of a major news story, perhaps the success of the local football team, there might be a rush in demand and the newspaper sells out, leaving many dissatisfied customers. How is the market likely to respond to this disequilibrium situation where demand exceeds supply at the ruling market price? In this example, we can predict that on the following day, assuming continuing interest in the story, local shops and stall holders will order more newspapers to meet anticipated demand, and the printers will run off more copies. It is also possible that, to avoid disappointment, some consumers will leave the market, perhaps following the story on local TV and radio rather than risk unfulfilled demand a second time. TV. In these circumstances, if suppliers have guessed correctly, the quantity of newspapers will adjust to secure the necessary equilibrium between demand and supply. Sales increase, all consumers are satisfied, the newspaper price remains unchanged. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 1.31. Reading and writing are solitary activities, and yet there is a social component that comes into play when we tell someone else about what we have read. An additional pleasure of reading is that you can urge and sometimes even persuade people you know and care about, and even people you don't know, to read the book you've just finished and admired and that you think they would like, too. We can talk about books to our friends, our colleagues, our students. We can form and enjoy communities that we wouldn't have otherwise had. Read Proust and you have something in common with other readers of Proust, not only the thrill of experiencing a marvelous and complex work of art, but the fact that you and those others now have, as your mutual acquaintances, his enormous cast of characters. Proust. You can gossip about people you know in common. Can you believe what happens to the Baron de Charlis by the end of the novel? De Charlis. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC, or freedom. Many preferences are a result of social norms and conditions that make them far from autonomous. The notion of autonomy should refer instead to decisions reached with a full and vivid awareness of available opportunities, with reference to relevant information, and without illegitimate or excessive constraints on the process of preference formation. When these conditions are not met, decisions should be described as unfree or non-autonomous. For this reason, it is most difficult to identify autonomy with preference satisfaction. If preferences are a product of available information, existing consumption patterns, social norms or pressures, and governmental rules, it seems odd to suggest that individual freedom lies exclusively or by definition in preference satisfaction, or that current preferences should, on grounds of autonomy, be treated as the basis for settling political issues. It seems even odder to suggest that all preferences should be treated equally, independently of their basis and consequences, or of the reasons offered in their support. MTC. Good job. MTC 1.33 St. Thomas Aquinas teaches that the human being's cognitive abilities are not merely bodily. He argues that in order for us to know a thing, we must recognize the category of things to which it belongs and be able to differentiate it from other things. For instance, when you see a particular animal, you recognize that it belongs to the cat species and you grasp how it's distinct from other animals. Categories are non-physical. You can't see, hear, or touch a category. Since categories are immaterial, anyone who comes to know a thing knows something immaterial. But only an immaterial substance can acquire knowledge of immaterial things. When we acquire knowledge, we gain something that can't be heard, weighed, or seen. Acquiring knowledge is not a bodily act like acquiring breath or food. Once air and food are taken into our bodies, they are changed. But when we know a thing, we aren't changing it. The human soul, which knows things in a non-physical way, is a non-physical or immaterial substance. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 1.34 Modernist art often assaults the concept of genre. A genre is a kind of contract between the artist and the consumer, an agreement that certain means will be employed in the pursuit of specific aesthetic pleasures, but in the 20th century this contract may have disconcertingly open terms. 2.0. For instance, the score to Igor Stravinsky's Renard identifies its genre as burlesque, a contract that may indicate the kind of pleasure the audience may expect, but that specifies little about the dramatic or musical form, the manner of staging, if any, or the sorts of performers. Igor Stravinsky Renard. But given the bizarre resources used in Renard, acrobats and dancers on stage costumed as animals, with singers who take random turns acting like the characters, Stravinsky had no simple way of naming his genre. Renard, Stravinsky. According to Jean Cocteau, the only command that Sergei Diaghilev, the impresario of the ballets Russes, one of the central engines of the modernist movement, gave him was, "Astound me." Jean Cocteau, Sergei Diaghilev. An astound me is the sort of demand that loosens the genre contract. An audience that wishes astonishment can't ask for any sort of expected delight, only for something completely different. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 1.35 Use of animals in research is sometimes opposed because animal models do not always identically mimic humans. As models, animals may provide additional insights into pathophysiology or disease, but they can also lead research astray. Opponents of animal research argue that each species has subtle but significant differences that cannot be predicted or fully understood to extrapolate to humans. For example, in a study looking at compounds that reduced ischemic stroke in rodents, none of the compounds were efficacious in human trials. The lack of efficacy was potentially due to the difference between natural strokes that develop over time in humans versus the experimentally induced strokes produced in the rodents over a period of weeks. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 1.36 Water, energy, and civilization go hand in hand. The various multi-century Chinese empires survived as long as they did in part by controlling floods in the Yellow River. This political and imperial power is captured in the word ji, which has simultaneous meanings to rule and to regulate water. Ji. In fact, an article by The Economist in 2009 noted that the Chinese word for politics, zhenzi, includes a character that looks like 3 drops of water next to a platform or dike. Politics and water control, the Chinese character implies, are intimately linked. Economist 2009, zhenzi. Indeed, water and politics go hand in hand for many societies and cultures, not only the Chinese. In the social sciences, there's a hydraulic theory of civilization in which water is the unifying context and justification for many large-scale civilizations, and we can see it playing out in a variety of contexts throughout history. One interpretation of this idea is that the justification for forming large cities in the first place is to manage water, and that large water projects enabled the rise of megacities. Cities and water projects go together. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 1.37. Once they leave their mother, primates have to keep on making decisions about whether new foods they encounter are safe and worth collecting. Using themselves as guinea pigs is one option, but social primates have found a better way. Kenneth Glander calls it sampling. Kenneth Glander. When howler monkeys move into a new habitat, one member of the troop will go to a tree, eat a few leaves, then wait a day. If the plant harbors a particularly strong toxin, the sampler's system will try to break it down, usually making the monkey sick in the process. I've seen this happen, says Glander. The other members of the troop are watching with great interest. If the animal gets sick, no other animal will go into that tree. There's a cue being given, a social cue. Glander. By the same token, if the sampler feels fine, it will re-enter the tree in a few days, eat a little more, then wait again, building up to a large dose slowly. Finally, if the monkey remains healthy, the other members figure this is okay, and they adopt the new food. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 1.38. Emotions are generally the result of the appraisal of events. Dependent on the outcome of appraisal, a coordinated set of responses involving behavioral and physiological systems is triggered. Thus, emotions trigger specific action tendencies and the necessary physiological support, facilitating overt action. A well-known example of this process is the fight-flight reaction involving increased heart rate and blood pressure, expansion of the bronchi and increased blood flow to the muscles, preparing the body for action. Conversely, depressed affect and grief are characterized by a quite different physiological reaction pattern, aimed at the conservation of energy. This is expressed in a passive reaction, often accompanied with a reduced muscle tone with the head directed downward. This passive condition may be adaptive, because it saves energy, and it may act as a signal to indicate that the person is in need of emotional or instrumental support from others. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 1.39. When does a competitive response to conflict make sense? Some situations such as elections or sporting events are inherently structured as competitions and call for competitors. However, many organizations inject competition into the workplace in ways that result in unintended negative consequences. For example, an internal sales competition may result in attempts to steal clients from other team members rather than from other firms, or to sabotage the efforts of team members in order to win. The trick with the competitive spirit is to harness its energy in positive directions while remembering to correctly identify those areas in which competition results in the best possible outcomes. When done correctly, competition can result in increased productivity and healthy camaraderie. When done poorly, competition pits team members against each other, leading to hard feelings and negative outcomes. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 1.40. Gift giving is one of the most mysterious areas of shopping. Irrational behavior is almost the norm in this area of consumer spending, and it is tolerated, expected, and even encouraged. Gift giving is less about shopping and more about the emotions of the shopper. This helps to explain the extreme nature of gift shopping and the illogical nature of the whole process. From the consumer's point of view, shopping for gifts is an emotional process that one gets caught up in. It is an area where the laws of supply, demand, and price go out the window as anxious shoppers do their utmost to bring pleasure to another person, and thereby, to themselves. The shopper shopping for gifts is the most susceptible of all shoppers. Smart retailers are ready to take advantage of the defenseless and emotionally vulnerable gift buyer. Meanwhile, the shopper knows he is vulnerable, but he is also unwilling to defend himself. Pleasing the recipient and conveying the intended emotional message are often more important than the price. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 1.4142. On average, animal protein production in the U.S. requires 28 calories of energy input for every calorie of protein produced for human consumption. 128. Beef and lamb are the most costly, in terms of fossil fuel energy input to protein output at 54:1 and 50:1, respectively. 541501. Turkey and chicken production require 13:1 and 4:1, respectively. 13141. The result is that 80% of the grain produced in the United States each year is fed to animals, resulting in the loss of about 34 million tons of protein. 8034. David Pimentel calculates that it takes nearly twice as much fossil energy to produce a typical American diet than a pure vegetarian diet. David Pimentel. This works out to about an extra 150 gallons of fossil fuels per year for a meat eater. 150. When we look at how much extra fuel it takes to feed them, meat eaters are effectively driving an extra 11 miles every day whether they really drive or not. 11. A recent study shows that the average American family would more effectively reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by adopting a vegan diet, one that uses no animal products, than by switching to a hybrid car. Factory farming is even more wasteful of water than fossil fuels. Agriculture accounts for 87% of all the fresh water consumed each year in the United States. 87. It takes 25 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of grain, and 2,500 gallons to produce 1 pound of meat. 125. When water shortages occur, citizens are often requested to not wash cars or water lawns, and to use low-flow shower heads. However, cutting back on meat consumption would save much more water than these sacrifices. 10 pounds of steak equals the water consumption of the average household for a year. 10. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 1.4345. Recently, Carl, one of my colleagues, had to meet a new manager named Martin, a man taking over the role from his old manager, Ted, whom Carl had worked with for several years. Carl Martin, Carl Ted. Carl had always got on very well with Ted. Carl Ted. Ted was a rather dry and elderly gentleman with not much of a sense of humor, but my colleague and he saw eye to eye and worked well together. Ted. The new appointee was very different. Apart from a keen sense of fun, he brought an intellectual mind to his work. He was younger and more creative and innovative. Despite two very different personalities, Carl managed to interact well with both men. Carl. He carefully nurtured both relationships. He did not pretend to be anyone other than himself, but did take care which aspects of his personality were on show at any one time. With Martin, the younger man, he was more jolly and fun to be with. Martin. They shared a lot of laughs and bounced many workable, creative ideas off one another. Meanwhile, Carl admired Ted, the older man, for his careful and dedicated approach to the job. Carl Ted. He was slow and invariably took the traditional path but, in his slightly pedantic way, managed to run an extremely efficient department. One day the inevitable took place. Martin suggested that the three meet together to discuss the year ahead. Martin. Carl's heart sank. Carl. This would be the first time he had met both men together. The thought of being a pig in the middle of these two was daunting. It would mean that he would be forced to reveal aspects of his personality that he had spent time shielding from both. It was a difficult meeting and Carl survived, but only just. Carl. The problem lay in the fact that the two relationships had flourished apart. If Carl had worked jointly with both men, I expect his behavior would have been more even and appealing to both personalities. Carl. There is no such thing as a right or wrong personality. Whatever our personality, it will work both for and against us and is interdependent on the personalities of others. MTC. Good job.